everyone. My name is Bonnie Solis. I'm here, part of Agents of Change, and we have Dr. Frederick Reamer here with us talking on boundary issues and dual relationships in behavioral health. So we're really honored to have you. I'm going to go ahead and introduce Dr. Reamer and all the wonderful things that he has done. So he was a professor and taught in the graduate program in the School of Social Work at Rhode Island College, which he had 40 years um, of experience within the school. Dr. Reamer received his PhD from the University of Chicago and has served as a social worker within the correctional and mental health setting. So we're very excited to be able to learn all of these great things that he has to share with us. He's also chaired on the National Task Force that wrote the National Association of Social Work Code of Ethics and served on the task force that added technology standards to the code. Dr. Reamer lectures both nationally and internationally on the subjects of professional ethics, professional malpractice, and liability and documentation. So we're very excited to have him here today so that we can learn on these subjects.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So we understand there's a lot of importance towards this topic, right? In protecting client welfare and upholding ethical practice. Would you be able to share with us as far as what are the most common types of boundary issues and dual relationships that arise within behavioral health?
Well, this is a complicated topic, and I've spent years conducting research on different kinds of challenges related to boundaries and dual relationships, or what we sometimes call multiple relationships, because sometimes the scenarios involve more than two people. And what I've learned in my research is that there are various patterns. I would say among the most common are situations that involve some element of intimacy. Notice I didn't use the word sex, right? That's part of it, right? I serve as an expert witness in many, many litigation cases, lawsuits, and many licensing board cases around the United States, where allegedly practitioners violated their ethical duty to maintain clear boundaries with clients, with former clients. And when I serve as an expert witness in these litigation cases alleging negligence or malpractice or licensing board cases, I can tell you that a significant percentage of the allegations focus on issues of intimacy. That is, in the extreme case, inappropriate sexual contact between a practitioner and a client, or a practitioner and a former client. But intimacy can take other forms as well. So I've testified in cases where a practitioner developed a very close relationship with a client or former client and wrote that individual very affectionate notes signed love, LOVE, which of course is subject to different interpretations, but put a copy of that note or that card before a jury, before a licensing board with the word love on it. And remember, these are cases where a disgruntled client or former client has filed a lawsuit or a complaint. That's the optics are very, very bad. So intimacy can take the form of written communications, text messages that have very intimate content, inappropriate self-disclosure by practitioners that have an element of intimacy where they're sharing information about the most intimate part of their personal lives. So intimacy, those are very common allegations. Then a second pattern is what I refer to as, and I apologize in advance for the academic jargon, but I could not come up with a better way to say this. And I refer to this pattern as instances where there are issues involving so-called emotional and dependency needs. That is where there's evidence that the practitioner's own issues, own struggles in life may intersect with the client's issues, the client's struggles, and you get practitioners who share very personal information about themselves. You can see this overlaps a little bit with the category that I refer to as intimacy, where the practitioner is sharing inappropriately very personal information about their lives because they want to develop a very close connection to this very special client. The question one might ask is whose needs are being met here when the practitioner shares such personal information about the practitioner's own life, or the practitioner is spending inordinate amounts of time with the client, sometimes outside of clinical sessions, to meet the clinician's own needs, own dependency needs, again, to use the jargon. A third pattern that I have found in both litigation cases and licensing board cases involve what I call personal benefit. These are cases where, oh, look, who repaired the practitioner's car, right? The client is an auto mechanic. The clinician is late for an appointment because they have a faulty transmission. They apologize to the client. The client says, hey, listen, I do this for a living. I can take care of it for you, where the boundary issue involves the client performing a service for the practitioner. It could be painting a house for a client who's a house painter. It could be a client who's a massage therapist giving the practitioner a massage. I testified in one case where the client was very affluent and loaned the practitioner money. So these are cases where there's an element of so called personal benefit, where the practitioner derives some kind of benefit from his, her, or their relationship with the client. A fourth pattern that arises in many, many cases in which I serve as an expert witness involves altruism. And one of the things I love about being a social worker, and I've been a social worker for decades, is that I get to spend my time with enormously kind, caring, and generous practitioners. That's the norm, overwhelmingly. And what I find is that sometimes practitioners are so caring, so generous of spirit, that they, in their altruistic efforts to help clients, cross the line in terms of boundaries. Practitioners who are too available, so to speak, they're available on weekends, they're available at night to help clients who struggle in life. Practitioners who give clients gifts because the clients are low income, and let's say, and the practitioner gives them clothing during a cold winter, and then the relationship ruptures, and there's evidence that a practitioner gave gifts to the client, loaned the client money, gave the client rides. I testified in one case where a client was alone in the universe, and a practitioner actually invited the client to spend the night at the practitioner's home with the practitioner's family. They actually had meals together. And then the relationship ruptured, and this now former client filed the licensing board complaint. So altruism is a very common theme. And the fifth pattern that I have found in my research and in my role as an expert witness involves what I call unavoidable and unanticipated circumstances. Some of you perhaps live and work in relatively small and rural communities. In my experience, it's not a question of if you bump into the client in the community at the one supermarket or grocery store or at a place of worship, or maybe your kids are classmates in the one third grade in town because it's a small town, and they become best buds and they want to have a sleepover and you didn't anticipate this. And so, how do you manage those boundaries? So, I would say those are the five most common patterns. And let me just add one more thing. If one takes a look at the allegations that are incorporated into lawsuits that are filed against behavioral health practitioners, if you take a look at the allegations that are incorporated in licensing board complaints filed against practitioners, a very, very, very significant percentage of these allegations involve boundary issues and dual relationships. This is a fact. And it's one of the reasons why a couple of states now require practitioners to obtain continuing education credits or hours specifically on the topic of boundaries and dual relationships. Now, many states require practitioners to obtain continuing education on ethics defined broadly, But a growing number of states are narrowing the mandate, requiring practitioners to get continuing ed hours and credits on this specific subject of boundary issues and dual relationships. And the reason is that licensing boards know that a very significant percentage of the complaints they get broach these very issues.
Yes, thank you so much for that information because it's definitely very helpful to understand the background behind where this is coming from and how it starts. So I appreciate that. And I would like to see a lot of this comes during that time of practice, of being licensed, correct? How is it that we can ensure that we are safeguarding what we're wanting to put in practice even prior to becoming licensed, ensuring that we are putting this into practice? When does it start to ensure that we're following ethics along with dual relationships?
And that's an easy one. It starts on day one, right? You walk into your graduate program in social work, counseling, marriage and family therapy, whatever it happens to be, on day one. In my opinion, educators ought to be introducing this issue. They ought to be acquainting students from day one on complex boundary and dual relationship issues. Now, you know, it doesn't take very long to give the lecture about why it's a bad idea to have a sexual relationship with a client. That is not a long lecture. And the truth is, the overwhelming majority of both students, early career practitioners, and even seasoned practitioners, they know, they know that's a prohibited relationship. Now, the reality is, I do serve as an expert witness in too many cases where practitioners who know that that's the rule cross that line. So I don't think we need to spend an enormous amount of time trying to convince students, early career practitioners, that they should not engage in those kinds of relationships. Those are the black and white issues. I think on day one, we ought to be introducing what I call the shades of gray issues, multiple shades of gray, where there are complex facts. And if you put those complex facts in front of even the most seasoned practitioners, you may find some reasonable disagreement among them about how to handle these boundary and dual relationship issues. I'll give you a couple of quick examples. Self disclosure. Now, we know that some clients are curious about their practitioners. They want to know, are they married? Do they have children? Are they in recovery? Where do they live? Have they ever used substances, particularly in substance use disorder treatment programs? So that's natural human curiosity. And clients sometimes ask practitioners questions about those details, and practitioners have to make decisions about whether to share personal information about themselves with their clients for therapeutic purposes to enhance the therapeutic alliance. And I know that there are some practitioners who selectively share personal details about their lives for therapeutic purposes. And I'm not someone who says you should never do that. I think there are times when it is appropriate to share some limited details about one's life to enhance that therapeutic alliance. I think one has to do that very thoughtfully. One has to distinguish between what I call in one of my books, entirely on boundary issues, what I call judicious self disclosure, as opposed to inappropriate self disclosure. But I know that practitioners disagree some about where to draw that line. Another example, clients sometimes offer practitioners gifts. Thank you so much. You've been so helpful to me. I'd like you to have this gift. And I know that practitioners disagree some about whether it's appropriate ever to accept a gift from a client. If so, what kind of gift? What's its value? What's its emotional significance? There may be cultural issues involved with clients who are identify as members of particular cultural or ethnic groups where giving a gift carries a lot of meaning, and to reject that gift could be deeply hurtful. We disagree about these things. Here's another quick example. Some behavioral health practitioners are in recovery. They go to 12 step meetings. They may live in a community where there are relatively few options because they're relatively small rural communities. Imagine a situation where a practitioner who's in recovery goes to his, her, or their own 12-step meeting and a new client, they barely know this new client, shows up at that meeting. They have to make a decision about how to handle that boundary issue. Do you stay at the meeting? If you stay, do you share? Do you have to find another meeting? And I know for a fact that there is disagreement among practitioners. So I think that's what we ought to be doing beginning on day one, introducing these issues, encouraging students to reflect on how they would handle these, how they would wrestle with these. And we can talk later, if you'd like, about the steps I would go through when these challenging circumstances arise.
Yes, definitely. It would be very important for us to understand putting this to play when it does arise for us, whether it be a rural area, whether it be for students, as supervisors that are listening or students listening. So I appreciate you sharing on this. What have we noticed as far as the types of issues that have evolved throughout your career with your experience, just seeing changes, maybe
Mhm,
even more recently with a lot of virtual practice or anything
mhm,
else?
mhm. So I would say that a number of the issues I encounter and consult on pertaining to boundaries in dual relationships have been around forever. They're likely to be around forever. Issues like the ones I just mentioned, decisions about self disclosure, handling gifts from clients, handling invitations, the client who invites the practitioner to the client's wedding or the baby naming or what have you. And again, there may be a cultural issue, an ethnicity issue involved there. These issues have been around forever, managing boundaries when you live and work in relatively small communities. However, I would say in relatively recent years, I've noticed a new genre, if you will, of boundary and dual relationship challenges. And a lot of them, as you suggest, have to do with technology. So we know that practitioners and clients are increasingly using technology for several different purposes. One is to provide services remotely. Now, some practitioners were doing this before the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic in the spring of 2020. But we know for a fact that the onset of the pandemic in the spring of 2020 greatly accelerated practitioners' use of technology to provide services remotely. Well, thank goodness the technology was available at a time when it was not possible to provide face to face or in person services. But I also began to notice the emergence of some complicated boundary issues, dual relationship issues associated with the remote delivery of services. Practitioners were typically providing those services from home. If they didn't know how to blur the background, come up with a virtual background, then clients may see the interior of a practitioner's home. Now, is that necessarily a bad thing? No, but when clients see the insides of our homes, that's giving information to them. They may be noticing the books on the bookshelf, the kind of art we have. I know of practitioners who all of a sudden had to provide services remotely from home while they're also caring for their 6-year-old child. And despite the post-it note on the door that says, "Mommy or Daddy's working, don't disturb," the 6-year-old barges in there and sits on mommy or daddy's lap and looks at the screen and says, "Who's that?" And it's the client. And so that's a boundary issue. And the client says, "Oh, is that your child? How old is she? She's so cute. What's her name?" And you have to have that discussion. And that's a boundary issue. Again, is it necessarily problematic? No. Does it have the potential for introducing some complexity in that relationship? Yes, I think it does. Plus, the reverse was true. We were able to see the interiors of clients' homes. We learned things about them. It's not exactly a home visit, but it has some elements of a home visit. And that's also giving us clinically relevant information. Here's another example: online searches for information. Now, that's a boundary issue. In my opinion, it's also a privacy issue. I know that because the technology is available, some practitioners contemplate conducting online searches for information about clients without the client's knowledge or consent. practitioners who are curious about some inconsistencies in the client's story, practitioners who are concerned about a client who may pose a safety risk if they meet together. And practitioners have to implement current ethical standards. There are codes of ethics standards regarding conducting online searches for information about clients without their knowledge or consent. Again, a boundary issue, privacy issues. Well, many practitioners concluded their formal training before this was even a possibility to do an online search. The reverse is also true. I mentioned a few moments ago that clients, understandably, are often curious about their therapists, their counselors. They, back in the day, would simply ask them questions. Well, now we know that a fairly significant percentage of clients conduct their own online searches, right? They put our names in search engines to see what they can find about whether we're married, whether we have kids, whether we're divorced, where we live. They can find out an enormous amount of information, which can complicate the boundaries, the dual relationship, right? Because they're learning a lot of details about our personal lives. I tell my graduate students, a couple times a year, I would do an online search on yourself so that you know what clients may know about your personal lives. And so that if they bring these things up, you're not blindsided. You've already rehearsed in your head how you might handle this. Another example, because of technology, which is, a very good thing in many respects, but every coin I know has two sides. So here's the other side of that coin. Because of technology, we know that sometimes practitioners are communicating with their clients outside of so called normal working hours. They're exchanging text messages, evenings, weekends. They sometimes have connected with clients on Facebook or other online social networking sites. And this has introduced a number of very complex and sometimes very problematic boundary issues. And without getting into any fine grained detail, I have testified in both lawsuits and licensing board cases where the evidence introduced by the plaintiff's attorney in lawsuits and by the prosecuting attorney in licensing board cases included copies of text messages, online social networking exchange messages that took place evenings, weekends. And plaintiff's attorney, prosecuting attorney argues that that's evidence of a boundary problem. Interacting with clients in that way, which allegedly was not in the client's best interest, confused the boundaries. This is a fact of life in the modern era. And by the way, those messages have a digital footprint. They're date stamped, they're time stamped. It's not hard to figure out when those messages were exchanged. And I have to review those messages as evidence in a lot of these cases.
Thank you for sharing that information. And how can practitioners go about maintaining this separation from the digital identity? And maybe even like now I see a lot of business pages
Hmm.
and see that clash between the two.
Hmm. So I know this is easy to say and perhaps more difficult to actually do, but I'll say it. Self-reflection, or as we say in social work, this is the social work jargon, use of self. In other words, being constantly aware, being constantly aware of how a practitioner is using him or her, their self, in relationship to the client with respect to the issues we're talking about today, boundaries, dual relationships. So here are some illustrations. I've had clients who have asked me questions about my personal life. I'm not offended by that. That's, I think, perfectly normal and understandable. And in the moment, I have to think about whether to share any details about my life, my family's life, my children's lives, things like that. I think the skilled practitioner who is cognizant of the ethical and clinical implications of boundary issues, dual relationship issues, in that moment is reflecting on the question, How should I handle my client's question about my personal life? Should I share any details? If so, which ones? What are my motives? Why am I doing this? There's a wonderful book by a scholar named Donald Schoen, Schon, Donald Schoen, entitled The Reflective Practitioner. He wrote this decades ago. And I think it conveys a profoundly important message with regard to what we're talking about today. That according to Schoen, the most skilled practitioners are those who have the ability to reflect, hence the title of the book, The Reflective Practitioner, who have the ability to reflect on what they are doing as they are doing it. Not the next day, not next week, not next month, but in the moment. And not every practitioner I meet does that. I think that's a skill we need to cultivate. So, for example, if a client offers me a gift, right? And clients have offered me gifts. I have to think in that moment, not the next day, not next week, not next month, but in that moment, how should I handle this gift? Is it appropriate for me to accept this gift? I have to think about a lot of factors, the nature of the gift, my relationship with the client's clinical challenges and profile. I think there are a lot of variables in that equation, and I need to reflect on those in the moment, which is not an easy thing to do. And so I think in social work education, in mental health education, marriage and family therapy education, whatever the behavioral health profession, we need to be cultivating this use of self, this ability to reflect on these boundary and dual relationship challenges as they arise. Easy to say, in my experience, not so easy to do.
Yes, definitely. Thank you. And how are we able to distinguish that difference between the boundary crossing and the boundary violation? Maybe in this matter or something
hmm
different?
hmm So, in my own writing on this subject, I spend a considerable amount of time on this distinction between so called boundary issues and boundary violations. And by the way, I did not invent those terms, colleagues of mine did. If you take a look at my work on boundary issues and dual relationships, you'll see in depth discussions of this profoundly important distinction. So, the boundary violations, frankly, I think are pretty easy um, to deal with. Don't have sex with a client. Full stop. That's a boundary violation. Don't borrow money from a client. That's a boundary violation. Full stop. Don't socialize with clients, having them over for dinner. That's a boundary violation. Full stop. So those ones are relatively easy. Again, I'm going to repeat. I have testified in cases where practitioners actually did all of those things, right? So even though we know we shouldn't cross that line, a very small percentage of practitioners, and I want to highlight it's a small percentage, do cross that line and have ended up paying a big price. End of career. Some of them have ended up in prison because they crossed that line. I think in professional education, in continuing education, we ought to be spending most of our time on boundary crossings. So, what are boundary crossings? Boundary crossings occur when we can't anticipate a boundary issue. We can't prevent a dual relationship. It's inevitable, impossible to avoid. For example, if you live and work in a relatively small rural community, these issues are likely to emerge, almost a certainty, that paths are going to cross outside of the professional client relationship. Well, that's a boundary crossing. That's not a boundary violation. That's a boundary crossing. Like, how should I handle my social encounters with my client, which are impossible to avoid in this small community? That's a boundary crossing. Or the example I mentioned earlier, a practitioner who's in recovery goes to his, her, their own 12-step meeting. They didn't anticipate that a new client would show up there. They didn't plan for that, but it happened. And they have to figure out how to handle that boundary crossing. I don't think that's a boundary violation. The example I mentioned earlier about self disclosure, about managing gifts that clients offer us, those are not necessarily boundary violations. I think they require very skilled reflection on these unanticipated, sometimes even inevitable dual relationships. And those are in the gray zone. And that's where I think professional education ought to focus the decisions we need to make when those circumstances arise. Those are the complicated cases.
And what would you say when maybe this is also based off of age, but sometimes clients are very appreciative of the services that they receive. And they mention, like, I love you, or I
Mhm,
appreciate this. And I see this a lot with little ones, 'cause a lot of my practice tends to be with small ones. And they
mhm,
mention, love you at discharge or closer to. How do
mhm,
we
mhm.
around that?
Well, I think context is critically important. So you use the example of young children. If I have a client who is 7 years old, 8 years old, 9 years old, and I'm doing play therapy or whatever it happens to be, and this child is like so proud of himself or so proud of herself for developing a new skill or a new insight and says, "Thank you, thank you, thank you, Bonnie, I love you." That's not a huge red flag for me. Coming out of the mouth of a child who isn't necessarily associating that word love with romantic love. It's a kid blurting out, "Oh, I love you. Thank you so much." Fine. But if I have a 32-year-old client who has a trauma history, who has struggled with boundaries in his, her, or their own personal life, who's deeply appreciative of the therapist and says something like, "You've been so helpful to me. And, I just can't thank you enough. I mean, really, I love you. I love you." Well, that's different. And I am going to hit the pause button and I'm going to say something like, "Tell me more about that." Right. And what does that mean to you? I'm going to explore the meaning of that statement. So if it turns out that this client is, if you will, falling in love or has fallen in love with the therapist, and by the way, that does happen, then I have to deal with that. And we have to have an honest conversation about, to use the jargon, the transference issues, the countertransference issues, um, whether this is a situation where I, as therapist, think, okay, I think we got a boundary problem here. This client is infatuated with me, and I may need to make a very difficult decision about termination and referral. Again, easier said than done. I get that. On the other hand, a 32-year-old client may be using that word love rather euphemistically with no romantic connotation at all. My job is to explore that. Ready for this one? This is a real case. A client who's 26 years old, trauma history, had been hospitalized psychiatrically a couple of times, developed what appears to be a very, very strong therapeutic alliance with the counselor. And the counselor had gone on vacation for a couple of weeks, summertime, comes back. They hadn't seen each other in a few weeks. And the client comes in and had the clinician's name, which was a short name, not the real name. It would be like Mary or Anne or something like that, literally tattooed on the client's fingers. Mary kind of thing, right? And proudly shows this to the therapist. Okay, boundary issue. And the therapist is reflecting. Remember the reflective practitioner. Okay, how do I handle this one? It's not typical for a client to tattoo the therapist's name on the client's hand. So, what does it mean? Does it mean that the client has fallen in love with the therapist? Is this simply a way to acknowledge the importance of the therapist? The therapist's job is to explore this as best as one can with regard to what this means. Because if that tattoo means that the client has fallen in love with the therapist, well, again, it may be a very difficult decision about termination and referral because of the dual relationship, the boundary issue. On the other hand, if the therapist is convinced after exploring this with the client that has nothing to do with love, this is a client who's saying, you know, you've changed my life. And this is my acknowledgement of the impact you've had on my life. And for that client, it's kind of like the equivalent of wearing like a little wristband, you know, to remind the client of the therapist's wisdom or something like that. Well, maybe that means something very different. And maybe there isn't a need to terminate and refer. Gray zone, gray zone, gray zone. And these are examples, I think, of why it is so important to explore the nuances around boundaries and dual relationships and to explore how we ought to handle these things when they arise. And they will arise.
Yes, thank you for sharing that. How about when a practitioner seems to misinterpret some of this information or kind of blur the distinction on maybe other cases that they can't kind of identify when and where this happens?
And your question is how to handle that?
Yes, that misinterpretation
Hmm.
between a clinician and a client.
Hmm. Well, I guess it depends first whether the clinician is aware of the misinterpretation. Is the misinterpretation simply in the client's head? Is the clinician aware of this? So I can think of two ways to approach this. One is if there appears to be some confusion, you know, um, where the therapist and the client are interpreting the word love differently or interpreting that tattoo on the hand differently. There's the possibility of misinterpretation. Then, as you might imagine, um, I think the task is to handle that clinically, to talk to the client, explore that, use one's judgment. Fine. But, not but, and I would argue that when these ambiguous boundary and dual relationship issues emerge, and so many of them, in my opinion, are ambiguous, I think our job, in addition to exploring these issues, the potential for misinterpretation with the client, we ought to be seeking peer consultation and supervision if we have a supervisor. Now, for people in private practice, they don't have supervisors, but they do have peers. Peer consultation. By the way, I don't use the term peer supervision. Some people use that term. I don't use it. I think it's a contradiction in terms. Supervision implies oversight. Well, if it's truly peer consultation, that's not oversight, that's peer consultation. So it's either supervision or peer consultation, in my opinion. In circumstances when we wrestle with issues around self disclosure, upon reflection, should I have shared that information with my client about my own personal life? How should I have handled the gift? How should I have handled the invitation? It may be that it's already a done deal, or maybe it's something that you still need to handle. I think peer consultation and supervision are absolutely essential. Doesn't mean that one's colleagues, one's supervisor, if you have a supervisor, necessarily know the right answer, air quotes. There may not be a right answer, but I think it's critically important to run this by smart, thoughtful colleagues as a way to try to identify the boundary issue, the dual relationship issue, to think about ways, the best ways to protect clients, and also the best way to protect us, to try to minimize the likelihood of a lawsuit, to try to minimize the likelihood of a licensing board complaint. I cannot emphasize enough the importance of peer consultation supervision. And I will tell you, in many of the legal cases I get involved in as a so called expert witness, that's not my term, that's the court's term. In so many of those cases where there's an allegation that a practitioner mishandled a boundary issue, mishandled a dual relationship issue, I have heard those practitioners say to me something like this: you know, in hindsight, I'm not sure I handled that particularly well. And I sure wish I had not made that decision on my own. In retrospect, I sure wish I had had the insight to run this by colleagues, a supervisor, before I did what I did. And that might have prevented this legal mess. I have heard many practitioners say that. And that's why I say reflective practice. Not only do I have to reflect on how am I going to handle this moment with the self-disclosure question or the gift or the invitation, but I also need to reflect on whether I need to hit the pause button, time out, so to speak, and get some consultation on how to handle this. And we can talk about this if there's time. Document the consultation, document the supervision. I cannot tell you how many cases I get involved in where allegedly the practitioner did consult a colleague, did consult a supervisor, but they didn't document it. And I work with a lot of lawyers, and lawyers love to say, if it's not written, it did not happen. If it's not written, it did not happen, which is not true. I have all kinds of conversations that I don't document, they happen. But when it comes to these kinds of issues, which we know have the potential to blow up, these boundary and dual relationship issues have the potential, not the inevitability, but the potential to blow up. The documentation is key because it demonstrates a good faith effort to think it through carefully, not to act impulsively. And that can help enormously if a disgruntled party alleges that the boundary issue, the dual relationship issue, was mishandled. And along those lines, in my consultations on these issues, I will often say to my colleague, well, I'm sharing with you my opinion, my opinion. I strongly recommend that you document this conversation once we, hang up the phone kind of thing. But before we do that, let's take a look at the relevant language in the Code of Ethics. If I'm talking to a social worker, it's the NASW Code of Ethics. If I'm talking to a mental health counselor, it's whichever code of ethics their licensing board has adopted. And I say that because there are three of them in mental health counseling. In different states recognize different mental health counseling codes. If it's a marriage and family therapist, there's one code. If it's a psychologist, it's one code. And I say, let's take a look at the language in the code of ethics around boundaries, dual relationships, conflicts of interest. That's another important concept here. Let's talk about how to apply that in this scenario. And then please document the fact that we reviewed the relevant code of ethics standards. Because even if someone disagrees with how you handled it, the fact that you consulted with me, the fact that you consulted with other colleagues or supervisors, the fact that you consulted the code of ethics demonstrates a responsible, good faith effort to handle this carefully. And that can help enormously if there are allegations.
Thank you for sharing that. It's definitely important information, not only to be able to distinguish those differences and these situations that can come up, but also that documentation part is always important. Is there a particular model or tool that you recommend for navigating these ethical dilemmas within real time? Is that within the reflective model as well?
Yeah. So if you take a look at what I've written on the subject of boundary issues and dual relationships, I have an entire book on this, bunch of, academic journal articles. If you look at what some of my colleagues have written on this subject, they typically advise, I mean, I can tell you what I advise, and my colleagues typically advise some of the elements to which I just referred. Always seek consultation, peer consultation and supervision if you have the time. Now, if a client is sitting in front of me and asks me questions about my life, am I going to say, hold on, let me call my colleague and consult on this before I answer you? That's just not realistic in some situations. Hence the importance of reflective practice, reflecting on what one's doing as one's doing it. But there are times when there is time. to consult with colleagues in supervision. So, consulting with colleagues and supervisors, reviewing relevant ethical standards, reviewing what are called national practice standards. So, I chaired, in addition to chairing the task force that wrote the social work code of ethics, I also chaired another task force that developed ethics informed practice standards pertaining to use of technology. And this was co sponsored by the National Association of Social Workers, the Association of Social Work Boards, that's the umbrella organization for all the licensing and regulatory bodies in North America, including Canada, the Council on Social Work Education, the accreditation body, and the Clinical Social Work Association. The task force that I chaired generated a 61-page document, 61 pages, ethics informed standards pertaining to the use of technology. And there's a whole section in there on boundary issues and dual relationships, guidelines concerning things like having an online relationship with a client after normal working hours, um, communicating with clients on Facebook or some other online social networking platform. All kinds of guidelines around boundaries and dual relationships with using technology. So, consulting those practice standards, critically important. Knowing the regulations in one's own state governing your license. So, if you're licensed, and for those working toward licensure, when you become licensed, you are governed by licensing statutes and regulations. Many of those guidelines, statutes, and especially regulations have been revised in recent years to strengthen the language on boundaries and dual relationships. And we're held to those. See, so I recommend, it's not a fun thing to do, but I recommend taking the time to look at the ethics related guidelines in the licensing statutes and regulations. Some of them have to do with things like um, relationships with former clients, right? Are there guidelines concerning whether it's ever permissible or whether it's only permissible if a certain amount of time has elapsed between termination of services and a social or intimate relationship? And those guidelines vary tremendously across the different states. So I think it's important to know those things. A lot of this licensing statutes and regulations have been revised to add language related to technology use. Things like, can you be Facebook friends with a former client? Not a current client. We all, I think, agree. Don't do that. But what about being a Facebook friend with a former client or somebody who's been a Facebook friend, knows what you do for a living, and wants to become your client? But in the meantime, you've shared all kinds of personal stuff on Facebook. So these are boundary issues, dual relationship issues that some of us never anticipated having to deal with. They are now incorporated into code of ethics standards, practice standards, sometimes regulatory and statutory guidelines governing our licenses, and we're held to these. So I think it behooves us to take a look at these guidelines. And then, and I recognize this is not at the top of the list of most people's, lists of fun things to do, but there's a lot of literature on these issues. There are books, there are journal articles, encyclopedia entries, some of which I've written, some of which colleagues have written. I think reading this stuff can be very helpful as we think through how to handle the kinds of complex issues I've raised, plus others that I haven't had time to raise.
Yes, thank you. Is there a specific one that you would recommend where a clinician could start off with, making sure that maybe they can keep this in their office or setting to where they can always refer to this? Because it always comes down to ethics, right? Is there a
Mhm, mhm.
recommendation to have?
Right.
You know, it might be useful to take a look at books specifically on boundary issues and dual relationships. There are a few out there. There aren't many, but there are a few out there. Um, one by my colleague Ofer Zur, Z-U-R, on dual and multiple relationships, I think is a very helpful guide. It's an anthology. Um, my book on boundary issues and dual relationships, I think, has lots of food for thought in there. Feel free to save your money. You can try to get it from a library, so you don't have to, spend money on it. Um, For social workers, I've written several other books on ethical standards in social work ethics decision making when complex issues arise. Other colleagues of mine have written books on ethical decision making, how to handle these, particularly the gray area um, challenges. So there's a lot of really good literature out there that I think we can use to educate ourselves. And of course, like what we're doing right now, continuing education. There are a number of, I think, really good continuing ed offerings specifically on this topic of boundaries and dual relationships. And I would add, a lot of these presentations, a lot of the literature addresses issues that did not exist when many contemporary practitioners finished their formal education. Some did, but a lot of the stuff, particularly related to technology, probably wasn't incorporated into the formal education that many of us received. So we have to keep up with this stuff through continuing ed, through reading, maybe not fun, but we have to do it. We're held to these standards, or what lawyers call standards of care.
Yes, thank you. So we appreciate you having this training so that we can always re-educate ourselves and provide this information on what is best to read and keep up with. And I know you've mentioned a lot on that supervision support and peer support. Um, Coming from that side of a supervisor or a leader within an organization as well,
Mhm.
what role should they play in promoting these ethical boundaries to reduce this risk?
So let me take, for example, typical employment settings for those who aren't in private practice. Um, School counselors, school social workers, hospital social workers, practitioners who work in substance use disorder treatment programs, public child welfare, nursing homes, hospice programs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I've had the opportunity and great privilege over the years, over the decades, to consult with a lot of these organizations around the United States and sometimes abroad. A lot of the work I've done has been international. And one of the things that I've done when collaborating with these organizations' administrators is to, number one, take a look at their existing policies and protocols regarding boundaries and dual relationships and conflicts of interest. And most organizations have guidelines. I would say they tend to fall into several categories. They were written, 20, 30 years ago. They're too simplistic. Basically, hit the delete button, start over. Then there's some organizations that have reasonably good, reasonably comprehensive policies and protocols regarding boundaries and dual relationships, conflicts of interest, but they need some tweaking because they don't include any content on, let's say, boundary issues that can emerge surrounding texting or email or use of online social networking platforms. These things need to be revised and upgraded. And then there are some organizations that have done a great job of revising, updating. Maybe these policies and protocols need a little tweaking. So, number one, I would say conduct an audit, what I call an ethics audit. Take a look at the existing policies and protocols regarding all the different kinds of dual relationship boundary challenges that can arise. And those are unique depending upon the setting. So, here's a quick example. Some practitioners work in home based programs. I think administrators of home based programs, and I'm a big fan of home based programs, need to take a look at some of the unique boundary issues that can emerge when you are in clients' homes. Anticipate the possibility that the counselor, the social worker, is going to be invited to have a meal with the clients in their home. Or there may be a crisis, and the only private space in that home to talk with a client is behind a closed door in a bedroom. Now think about the optics, going into a bedroom and closing the door to talk to a client. So things happen in home-based programs that I think need to be built into the policies and protocols around boundaries, dual relationships. People who work in substance use disorder treatment programs, that's a different context. I've consulted with lots of programs that provide substance use disorder treatment services. And I would say almost always there are some staff who are in recovery. That's part of the model. Fine. They're using their lived experience to help clients. I would say in that context, it's important to take a look at the boundary related policies and protocols around self disclosure, right? What do you do if you end up in the same 12-step meeting? It's a different context. I've spent much of my career outside of my academic career working in prisons, federal and state prisons. The norms around boundaries and dual relationships are so strict in prisons, and they're different from what I find in many other settings. If I'm a school social worker with young children, I want to have policies and protocols about how to handle it. If a kid climbs on the counselor's lap, it hugs the social worker, the counselor. These are unique situations in that setting. So, number one, conduct an audit, identify relevant policies and protocols related to boundaries, dual relationships, conflicts of interest, including when to report that there might be one seeking supervision, all that, and revising those as needed, and providing training, conducting training for staff on these issues with real life examples. That's what I do. I come up with examples, scenarios unique to that setting, and then we talk about how to handle those. I think that's what we need to do.
Yes, thank you for mentioning it. It's definitely something that we can encounter, especially as we grow through our field of uh,
Mhm,
starting off in that home setting, case management setting, and then moving through different practices through our internship.
mhm.
And so thank you for sharing that. Would you mind sharing a very important case with us, of course, keeping confidentiality,
Mhm,
but something important to kind of keep in mind for practitioners as we go along through our own practice, whether it be in program or private practice?
mhm. Well, I'll give you a quick example that raises an issue I've not yet mentioned today, and I recognize this may not apply to all of your viewers, but I think it's a great teaching example. So I was an expert witness in a case where I had to testify about the ethics of an agency hiring a former client. So this is an agency, very important agency, providing critically important services, where um, they were recruiting for entry level case managers. And a former client who was doing well wanted to give back, so to speak, and applied for the job. Had a lot to offer: lived experience, peer support, all kinds of reasons why the agency might want to hire a former client. That, of course, introduces potential boundary issues, dual relationship issues, conflict of interest issues. And the executive director ended up hiring the former client. Several staff were very concerned about emerging boundary issues, emerging dual relationship issues. This former client, now staff, is now socializing. During a holiday weekend, a staff person has a party, invites colleagues, and the person who hosted this was that person's therapist 4 years earlier. So that means the former client is at the former therapist, now colleagues, home. That individual was also supervised, once hired by someone who had been his former therapist. Well, that's a potential conflict of interest, particularly when job performance issues arose, which they did in this case. And the former therapist, who's now the job supervisor, had to give some critical feedback to the former client, who's now a colleague and a supervisee. The relationship ruptured. In this case, blew up badly, and I had to testify as an expert witness in this case. And I think this case illustrates the nuances that we have to keep in mind in cases where we don't anticipate these kinds of problems. So when I was on the witness stand, I did not say I am adamantly opposed to hiring former clients. I think there are programs where it makes sense to do that. Substance use disorder treatment programs, programs that serve people who experience homelessness, programs that serve people who are HIV positive or who have AIDS. I know these programs have sometimes hired former clients very, very effectively, but I've also seen problems. So I argue, and this is I think the key point, or the reflective practitioner, to go back to that concept. If I am considering hiring a former client who's qualified, I'm not simply going to hire that former client. I am going to hit the pause button. Let me go back to my list. I'm getting consultation, I'm getting supervision. I am looking at code of ethics standards around boundaries, dual relationships, conflicts of interest. I'm reviewing our policies and protocols, and I'm going to put in place guardrails to try to prevent problems related to boundaries, dual relationships, conflicts of interest. Example, if I agree to hire a former client, I'm going to have a policy in place that says that person's supervisor in the job should not have been someone who provided services to that individual when that individual was a client, because that's a conflict of interest, which can be very harmful to that former client, now colleague. I'm going to limit that former client, now colleague's access to records about people who were clients when they were a client, because that's a privacy issue. And I've got a whole list of things I would do as a reflective practitioner to, number one, enjoy the benefits of hiring a former client who has a lot to offer while minimizing the likelihood of problematic boundary and dual relationship issues. And P.S., when I come up with those policies and protocols, I'm probably going to run all of them by an attorney who specializes in defending human service and behavioral health practitioners to take a look at the policies and protocols, suggest some edits, some tweaks, and that I think is also a great risk management strategy that can pay off.
Thank you for sharing that. I've definitely heard where clients are really moved by the services that they receive, and they're wanting to now
Mhm.
pursue this career or be
Absolutely.
a mental health professional. So it's definitely
Mhm.
important. Thank you for sharing. I did want to go back, as we were mentioning earlier at the start, you were wanting to come back to this as students or interns kind of face some of these things. What were some of the examples that you were wanting to provide?
Well, some students, I mean, in addition to the ones that I mentioned, some students, not all, are relatively young. I mean, I've had graduate students who switch careers, they come back for an MSW at age 40, age 50, whatever. But, quite a few students are relatively young, and they may not be that much older than their clients. And that can create a boundary issue, right? Where a client begins to view that student, that intern in a practicum placement as more like, a peer, a friend, asking those personal questions. Oh, I see you're wearing an engagement ring. Is that new? And it is new. Oh, when did you get engaged? And they want to have a conversation like they're buddies because there's not much of an age difference there. That can be an issue. I've had students, graduate students, who are members of the same ethnic group, cultural group as the client. And the client, understandably, I'm not being critical here, the client may feel like there's a special affinity here. Oh, we're members of the same club. We're members of the same club. We're both from Haiti. We're both from the Dominican Republic, our respective families, or whatever. And they may feel a special kinship, which can lead to some boundary challenges, as in an expectation by the client that the counselor, the social worker, will be forthcoming with details about the counselor's own life because we're members of the same club. Or maybe there's an ethnic festival in the community and they both go and they are there with their respective families and they have to deal with that boundary issue. They have this encounter at one of the, food vendors and the social worker's kid says, "Oh, mommy, who's that?" Because the client came up and maybe even hugged the therapist. "Oh, wonderful to see you. Here, these are my kids." And all of a sudden, it's like the group hugged, right? And the social worker's kid says, "Who's that? And what do you?" For reasons I'm not at liberty to disclose, I cannot even acknowledge that there was some. I mean, you have to deal with this, right? I would say one of the most important lessons I've learned in my career, and I think this applies especially to students, early career practitioners, is anticipate the possibility of boundary and dual relationship challenges. Acknowledge them early in the relationship. So, for example, if you live and work in a relatively small rural community, I would say, in addition to the standard speech about confidentiality and its exceptions, everybody knows what that speech is, right? Everything's confidential. There are some exceptions: threat to self, threat to others, mandatory reporting, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I would say add to the list, talk about boundaries. You know, we both live in this community. It's a small community. We're likely to bump into each other in the community. Let me talk to you about how I handle those encounters, right? I don't want you to be insulted if I don't approach you. Talk about the boundaries. If you're in recovery and you're public about that, and a client's in recovery, talk about how you would handle it if you end up at the same 12 step meeting and document those conversations. And one other thing I want to mention is in what I call the digital age, where technology is so pervasive. I strongly recommend having what we call a social media policy. And that's incorporated in the social work code of ethics. Now we added that. It's in that document that I referred to earlier, the 61-page ethics informed standards pertaining to the use of technology. It's basically saying to the client in writing, as well as verbally explaining it, let me tell you how I handle myself on the internet. I can't be your Facebook friend. And here's the reason why. And you say it kindly and politely, but you say it and you document that you said it to try to nip these problems or potential problems in the bud. You nip it in the bud as best you can. That's what a social media policy does. It tells a client, if you need to reach me, it's after hours. Please don't text me. I can't guarantee that I'll see that in a timely fashion. It may not be secure. Please reach me this way. That's a boundary issue as well as a privacy issue. Explaining to the client in the social media policy, literally in writing, I want to respect your privacy. I want to respect the boundaries. I'm not going to conduct an online search for information about you without your knowledge or consent. That is the ethics standard in the behavioral health professions now. And the policy says, and there may be some exceptions, right? If there's an emergency, if there's a crisis, if you're missing in action, I may need to do an online search for safety purposes. And I'm going to tell you that's my policy. And if I do it, I'll document that I did it. And if I see you again, we'll talk about it. All these things I think need to be embedded in a social media policy, particularly addressing boundary and dual relationship issues. And to repeat something I said earlier, so many contemporary practitioners finish their formal education at a time when these phenomena did not exist, but they do exist now.
Yes, thank you for touching on that because it is definitely something newer that we need to ensure that we're addressing
Mhm,
within our practice. So thank you so much. And one last question here, Dr. Reamer.
mhm.
What would be one thing that you would want mental health professionals to be able to take with them? One important message for them as we wrap up.
Well, forgive me for repeating myself. Reflection, 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 reflection. It's having that awareness in the moment. If I'm self disclosing details to my client, asking myself in that moment, why am I doing this? Why am I sharing these details? Whose needs are being met here? There's a Latin phrase that I adore: cui bono. CUI in Latin, CUI is pronounced qui, bono. Translation: for whose benefit? Why am I sharing these details? Why am I thinking about accepting this gift from the client? Why am I considering giving the client a gift? The low income client who needs a winter coat and I have an extra coat. Why am I doing this? Is this the best way to do this? Is there another way to do this to diffuse the boundary issue? For example, saying to the client, oh, I'm aware of this clothing closet. I happened to be there. I saw this coat. Would you like to have this? The client doesn't need to know that it's from the practitioner, right? It's having that awareness in the moment around self disclosure, managing invitations, managing gifts, managing the unanticipated boundary crossing in the small rural community. having that awareness in the moment, reflecting on it, and making a sound, ethics informed decision as best we can. And if there's time, which there isn't always, seeking consultation, seeking supervision, consulting relevant ethical standards, consulting relevant policies and protocols, um, and documenting our decision making.
Thank you, Dr. Emer. And we really appreciate your time today, and overall, right, throughout the social work career and practice. We understand how important our code of ethics is. It's what we follow, it's what we go to. It's kind of like our Bible, right? Per se, how we see things. But we appreciate the work that continues, to shape our profession, how we understand and uphold the integrity within ourselves, within clients. So, thank you for your time today, and thank you for sharing all of your knowledge with our viewers that we will have watching this today.
My pleasure and my privilege. Thank you for having me.
I hope you enjoyed this continuing education course from Agents of Change. Want to earn your CE credits for this course? Visit agentsofchangetraining.com or the link in the description to purchase the course and take the post test. If you're looking for more CEs, check out our unlimited plan. You will get unlimited access to 150 plus ASWB and NBCC approved continuing education courses for one low annual fee. We're always adding new courses. Did I mention we also have 5 free CE credits available too? Check it out at agentsofchangetraining.com.